Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to study science and the Bible. I pray that you would guide us with your Holy Spirit in the name of Jesus. Amen. The gut-brain connection. Now, the first book that I know of on planet Earth that talks about the connection between the gut and the brain is the Bible. This is fascinating. Back in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel, we see the gut-brain connection portrayed all the way back there, 2,500 years ago, some 500 years before Jesus. And it's actually been termed potentially the first recorded scientific study that's ever been conducted. The first recorded scientific studies. You even see in places like the National Institutes on Health, they talked about the fact that the Bible has within it, in the book of Daniel, the first clinical study, the first clinical trial that was ever recorded. They actually say this. The National Institutes on Health, they talk about this. Some time ago, a book was written, and this book is called A History of Epidemiologic Methods and Concepts. And you also see in this book, you see the same thing, that it talks about Daniel chapter 1 as perhaps the first clinical trial. It's at least the first recorded one that we know of. So we see this scientific study. You have a control group, the normal wise men of Babylon, and then you have Daniel and his friends who are separated, live a different lifestyle. They change their lifestyle, and then their lives are changed by this lifestyle change while the other people continue on in their normal lifestyle. And what changed? It was the food that they put into their body. It enhanced the cognition of Daniel and his friends. It benefited their health. What's fascinating is scientists today have done scientific studies on this very same thing, and they see that it causes benefit to health. It can reverse diseases. It is amazing what ends up happening when you follow these principles that were given to us all the way back in Daniel chapter 1, the first clinical trial, or the first recorded clinical trial. Well, what took place there? Daniel didn't want to eat the unhealthy foods that were given in the kingdom of Babylon. It could have been because some of them were sacrificed to idols. That's a possibility. But also, it could have been that they were unhealthy foods, unhealthy meats that Daniel wouldn't eat because God had said to the Hebrews that they were not to do this. Daniel he said he didn't want to defile himself with these foods. We read in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portions of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." Daniel believed by drinking the wine, this alcoholic wine, and eating these dainty meats of the king, that it would somehow defile him, it would make him unhealthy, that it would negatively impact him. So what did Daniel do? He suggested, it says in Daniel 1 verse 12, "Prove your servants," that means test them, "I beseech you," that means I beg of you, I plead with you for 10 days. Test it. "And let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink." Now, pulse, what does that mean? Pulse. The word pulse means things grown from seed. So he said, give us plant foods for 10 days, and let's compare and contrast the difference between us and those who eat the normal food of the king. What's very fascinating, you may have heard of Dr. Neil Nedley. He has a depression recovery program. If someone seriously struggles with depression, I believe it's probably one of the best, if not the best program on the planet. And so if you really struggle, going to his in-house program can be absolutely life-changing. So I would encourage that. And it's interesting, they actually chose to do it for 10 days. They have a 10-day program, and it enhances people's cognition just like the Bible said. By following these principles, obviously they do even more at Dr. Nedley's program, his depression recovery program, but it's absolutely life-changing. So science proves that it actually works even today, just like it did in Daniel's day. There was a gut, the things they ate affected the brain. Fascinating. So the Bible told us there was a connection between the gut-brain. What ended up happening at the end of the 10-day study? Notice what it says here. "Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar." So he brought the wise men in, including Daniel and his friends, and he communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. So because of their faithfulness to God and what they ate and avoiding negative things like alcohol, it enhanced the cognition of Daniel and his friends more than all the other wise men of Babylon. We see it here in verse 17. And as for these 4 children, that's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who their Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. It says, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Could it be that our diet, what goes into our gut, can affect our intellect? We see this in the time of Daniel. And I'm going to show you a video clip that shows scientifically today that people are affected. This is a clip from our documentary called 8 Secrets to Ancient Health. It's a mixture of archaeology, history, and cultures of longevity with modern science showing why people can do better mentally, physically, and their lives can be changed and even reverse disease by what they choose to eat and the lifestyle habits they live. So I'm going to show that clip, and then my wife will come up directly after that.
But the main thing that folks should be concerned about is how long you live and how likely you are to get disease. And there have been 3 major studies published on this subject, big meta-analyses. And these meta-analyses, and only 3 big ones have been published, they show consistently that low-carb diets, in other words, low plant food diets, high animal food diets, consistently they show that they're associated with more heart disease and more death, more mortality.
If you look around the world and you look at these people in the blue zones, the average percentage of calories from carbs ranges from about 50% to about 80%. Carbs are not the enemy, refined carbs are the enemy.
There have been a number of recent studies. Dr. Beeshold out of Phoenix, Arizona, first she did an observational study showing that plant-based diet actually significantly improves your depression and anxiety stress score. It's called a DASS score.
So the mood actually is improved when you get the right amount of carbohydrates, but also the right type of carbohydrates and less protein.
Then she followed up with an interventional study, and that's where she took people who are not on a plant-based diet and put them on a plant-based diet for 2 weeks. She also put them on a plant-based diet plus fish for 2 weeks to see which one would be superior. And it turned out the fish diet wasn't any more superior than the carnivore diet. But the plant-based diet, significant, dramatic changes, statistically significant changes in just 2 weeks in their mental ability.
We see when people go on this diet and drink plenty of water, get plenty of rest, follow these natural remedies, that it's just like something snaps in their brain, and it doesn't take like weeks or months.
Plant-based diet is key in our program for depression and anxiety recovery. The results are outstanding because it's a comprehensive approach. It's not just diet. We also utilize exercise, and we're utilizing correct thoughts and a lot of different modalities. But the diet is a key element.
I went on a plant-based diet about 5 weeks ago.
It's amazing because even if they had not told me he had the diet change, the first thing I noticed was he was bringing his schoolwork in.
And my teacher has actually been bragging on how much better I've been behaving since I've been on the diet.
In class, he wasn't getting as distracted, that he was paying attention, he was able to listen more closely, he was being alert, his discernment was better, he was more diligent, everything.
I can pay attention more. My mind is more clear since I've been on the diet.
It's just a huge improvement. And I also noticed he lost a lot of weight. But the main things I noticed was behavioral.
A study in a middle school has showed clearly that switching the menu from animal source to plant source diet almost eliminated absenteeism, increased and enhanced attention and homework performance and performance at school. It almost eliminated acts of violence as well as teen pregnancies.
And so they just feel better. Everywhere the blood flows, everywhere that perfect circulation goes, they feel better. Not just in body, but in mind. Clears up their thoughts even.
And every single day since I've been on a plant-based diet, the clarity continues to increase and my face continues to look younger and my body feels like I feel like I look more vibrant. I've looked at pictures of myself before and after, and I look 5 years older, even just 10 months ago, than I do now.
What we eat does get turned into neurotransmitters. It actually helps us or hurts us, depending on what we're eating in regards to our brain chemistry. And it plays a vital role in health of the brain.
They'll say within 3 or 4 days, they seem to have clarity. They're alert. They listen in class better. They absorb more, and they do better on their tests.
The fog has been lifted out of my head. I think clearer. I've got better ideas, I believe. I can put 2 and 2 together faster, and just in general, I'm happier.
In fact, diet alone, studies show that diet alone will reduce your depression and anxiety scores by half just by dramatically changing your diet to a plant-based. And so that's significant. Now, we go for more than just half, and so that's why we have a whole program that includes more than this. But just the diet alone will make a big difference.
You don't have to choose between high quality living and longevity. It's the same program. The same New Start approach to living helps you live longer, and it helps you live better.
Isn't that amazing, this video that we just watched? How one thing that was changed was their diet. The diet was changed in this school, and it made such a lasting impression on the young people, but not just an impression, but a whole change in the atmosphere of this school. That that's all they changed was just the diet, and yet it had all these benefits. It's so powerful that we're seeing now the connection between the gut and the brain. That what we put in our minds, what we eat, what nutrition we have, ultimately affects our brains. And we not only see that through science, but we also see it in the Bible, the gut-brain connection. Here in Lamentations chapter 1 and verse 20, it says, "Behold, O Lord, for I am in distress, my bowels are troubled." And so here it's showing the connection between your bowels being troubled and being distressed, the gut-brain connection. Also in Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 19, it says, my bowels, I am pained at my very heart." Isn't that interesting, that the bowels and emotions and in our hearts, it's just neat how the Bible, it was an understanding in the Bible times that there was this connection, but somehow we've come away from these understandings, right? We don't see the connection between the gut and the brain, but science is discovering this again, that there is this connection between the gut and the brain, and it's a beautiful connection. And what's interesting is that the gut and the brain have the vagus nerve as a way of communicating between the two. But what's interesting is that 90% of the information goes from the gut to the brain and not the other way. Isn't that powerful? From the gut to the brain. So if that connection was severed, the stomach could continue to do its work, because it doesn't rely on the brain to do all its functions. I just think that's an amazing thing. And so it shows us that there is this connection, that a lot of the information is coming from the gut to the brain and so forth, why we are having these problems with anxiety and depression and all these types of things. But also 2/3 of our immune system resides in the gut. 2/3 of the immune system resides in the gut. So ultimately, not only is it our mental health, but our health in general, trying to ward off diseases happens from having a healthy gut, because 2/3 of our immune system is there. Look at this here. This is so interesting. Counsels on Diet and Foods, page 50. The abuses of the stomach by the gratification of appetite are a fruitful source of most church trials. Isn't that interesting? A fruitful source of most church trials comes from the stomach, comes from our gut. This was said a long time ago, before people even understood it. And if you had read this before, you would have thought, are you kidding me? There's bigger problems in the world today than having a healthy gut, right? But this is what science is showing us today, that high-fat diets actually lead to depressive, anxious symptoms in mice. And it also promotes inflammation. And inflammation, when you have inflammation in the body, that is a direct marker for depression. So having inflammation in the body is a marker for depression. And the study goes like this. They had some mice on a high-fat diet. So like you see here, this mouse eating cheese, that's high-fat, and the other mice on a normal diet. And what do you think happened? So the high-fat diet mice exhibited inflammation and other behavioral issues like anxiety and depression and repetitive behaviors and forgetfulness. This is what was happening in them. Then what the scientists did is they took the bacteria out of the stomachs of the high-fat diet mice and put it into the intestines of the regular diet mice. And what do you think happened to the regular diet mice? What do you think happened to their behavior? This is what happened. They started to exhibit anxiety, memory impairment, repetitive behaviors, and inflammation, which again is one of the factors for depression. So you see that just the bacteria in the intestines of the high-fat mice being put into the regular diet mice ends up exhibiting the same behaviors and mental state that the others did. So there's something about this bacteria, right? The bacteria, whether you have good bacteria or bad bacteria and what ratio you have, depends on how you are feeling. And look at this quote right here from Child Guidance. It says, eating too frequently, too much, and of rich, unwholesome food destroys the healthy action of the digestive organs, affects the brain, and perverts the judgment, preventing rational, calm, healthy thinking and acting. So what is it saying here? That eating too frequently, too much, and of rich, unwholesome food. Rich foods like high-fat foods, high-sugar foods, high-refined sugar foods, and high-refined fat foods, right? Ends up affecting our digestive organs and in turn affecting our brains, just like the science is showing us. So if you're eating a high-fat diet, you're feeding the bad bacteria, and therefore you're having the negative effects in your mental state. Another quote here from Child Guidance, it says, it cannot be too often repeated that whatever is taken into the stomach affects not only the body, but ultimately the mind as well. It is difficult and often well nigh impossible for one who is intemperate in diet to exercise patience and self-control. Isn't that interesting? So here it's saying that if you are intemperate, if you don't exercise temperance in all things, right, where you're balanced and you're not just taking whatever you want into the stomach, if you're intemperate, then you have less ability to control yourself and be patient. And we see that, right, in ourselves. We see, like, when we're impatient, so we're like, why am I feeling like this? And we pray and we plead with God, and you're like, why am I feeling like this? Could it be something that we've eaten is causing that, right? But look at here, this 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 and 6. This is an interesting concept that goes along with this. It says, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience. This is a building block, right? You start with faith, then you grow in virtue, and then you grow in knowledge, and then temperance. So when you exercise temperance, you have patience. And so before patience comes temperance. And so if we're living a balanced life, then we have more self-control. But if we're being intemperate in things, we have less control of our thoughts and our feelings, our emotions, and more we're seeing this as science is telling us these things, right? What the Bible has told us for so long, science is showing us this more and more. And now Chad's going to come up and show us some of the science behind these things.
So the Bible shows a connection between the gut and the brain, that temperance comes before patience. It talks about people having these emotions and it affecting their bowels. And it's interesting because science bears this up today. We see that in a Scientific American in 2010, it was entitled, "Think Twice How the Gut's Second Brain Influences Mood and Well-Being." They call the gut the second brain. What's interesting, if you sever that vagus nerve that connects the gut to the brain, the gut can actually work independent of the brain. And the article, when you go on to read it, what it talks about, it talks about how people having sour guts or sour stomachs can have a sour mood. It's very interesting. But 100 years ago, we were told this exact same thing, almost the same wording. It's just amazing to think about. It says people who have a sour stomach are very often of a sour disposition. Everything seems contrary to them, and they are inclined to be peevish and irritable. If we would have more peace among ourselves, we should give more thought than we do to having a peaceful stomach. Now, isn't that interesting? That in 2010, science was showing us that people with sour guts can have a sour emotional state. We were told this over 100 years ago in Counsel on Diet and Foods. Very interesting, almost word for word. It was like something 100 years ago was now put into the modern newspapers, the scientific journals. Very fascinating. You know, and when we think about this, 2/3 of our immune system is found in our gut. Did you know that? 2/3 of our immune system is found in the gut. So if our immune system is affected, wow, how much of our body could actually be affected? That's something to think about. And so let's think about this. How could this apply to, modern day people? Well, when women are pregnant, women obviously have their own microbiome, the scientists call it. That means their own bacterial makeup, many different bacteria within their body, different species of bacteria throughout their body. And what happens is, when they give birth, the baby passes through the birth canal, and that is when it is given in all the crevices in its mouth. It actually receives the bacteria from its mother. And this is a wonderful thing from that child, especially if its mother had good bacteria. And so it gives that to the child, and so that child then works with that, and those things become actually a benefit because the bacteria, we're going to look at further, we're going to see what the bacteria does for us. There's good bacteria and there's bad bacteria. But something happens that when a child is born not by a vaginal birth, but rather by a C-section, there can be several different negative consequences scientists have discovered. Because what happens is you come out and you don't actually receive the same bacteria that you would have had you been born vaginally. Well, what ends up happening, this was a study, C-section babies have statistically higher disease rates of certain diseases. Now, this is not a study of, 12 or 200 children. It was a study reported in the journal Pediatrics. There were 2 million babies studied. This is a massive study. And over the course of 35 years, this is a serious study. What did they discover? They discovered that children who are born by C-section have higher levels of allergies, asthma, bowel disorders, rheumatism, and leukemia. Now, what on earth is taking place here? And scientists are actually saying, could it be? And I think some of it most certainly is, as a result of the fact that the children do not have the bacterial makeup that they should have through a natural birth. And so now some of the studies are being done right now where they're actually swabbing the women, the mothers, and then taking those swabs and putting it in the cracks of the baby so that baby will begin to be populated with the microbiome, with the bacteria that they should have had when they were born. And they're looking to see, could this actually help? And I think we'll find it probably does. Obviously, the best thing is to have a natural birth, but obviously some people cannot, and we need to recognize that, and if you can't, then you just can't. I mean, that's, if someone's going to die or there's going to be a serious negative side effect, but if possible, the best way to go is through a natural birth so that your child is less likely to have many of these diseases. Because remember, the majority of your immune system comes from your gut, right? So that being the case, if you don't have the gut bacteria to help these things, to help you fight off and stay strong and stay healthy and have a great immune system, it could very seriously negatively impact your health. And this is very interesting. An article came out some time ago in the Huntington Post, and its title was "The Surprising Link Between Gut Germs and Toddlers' Tantrums." You say, what are you talking about? Gut germs and toddlers' tantrums? Scientists have actually studied it out. What they've discovered is they looked at toddlers and they noticed that obviously certain toddlers are open, they're outgoing, they're positive, they're social, they're not nervous all the time. Then you have the nervous ones, you have the cranky ones, you have the ones who are kind of antisocial. And you have these distinctions between the children. They looked at the bacterial makeup of their guts, their microbiome, as the scientists call it, and they discovered that the children that were grumpy and fussy and negative had less diversity in their bacteria within their gut. And the children who were more outgoing and more social had a greater diversity of bacteria in their gut. You say, could it really be that impacting on these individuals? It most certainly is. The Bible talks about the fact that there's this gut-brain connection. We were told about it 100 years ago, and we see these things are showing up now in modern science. These things sounded like strange things, 100 years ago. Come on, that's weird, 19th century, quackery. Now it's cutting-edge science. Now they're actually getting ready to come out with a scientific journal specifically on the gut-brain connection. This is just cutting-edge science today. So what if maybe you don't have as good a ratio? Maybe you are more of a grumpy person. Maybe you have more negative characteristics. Maybe you're more antisocial. Could you possibly get a greater variety of bacteria in your gut? And the question is, if you could, how? Well, that's what we're going to try to look at just now. Well, scientists have discovered, this is taken from Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And they have an article, and they talk about, as they've looked at the guts of people, guess what kind of diet gives you the greatest diversity of healthy bacteria? Because here's the thing. You will either have good bacteria, bad bacteria. We all have good and bad. But those who have more of the good and a greater diversity are going to actually feel better. They'll be less stressed. They'll have less inflammation. All of these things we saw in the mouse studies, they're going to feel better as a result, feel less depressed, and typically be more social. So how could we get to that point? Well, what kind of diet would do it? They found that vegan diets or plant-based diets. Now, I want to be clear, though. The best diet is whole plant-based foods, because we're going to find out why. You want to get the fiber. You want the whole foods there. So you could be a junk food vegan, and that's not healthy. You could be someone who eats Oreos all day that are vegan. You could drink beer all day and be a vegan. Right? You could eat white bread all day and be a vegan, but those things aren't healthy. We're talking about whole plant-based foods, and we'll show you why in just a moment. But eating a greater diversity, eating a plant-based diet, especially whole food plant-based diet, is going to give you the greatest diversity, and I'll get to why in just a moment. You'll see what that bacteria does for you. If you work for it, it will work for you and make you a happier person. Some time ago, in the Journal of Plant Physiology, they came out with an article, and it's the title of it, it's a review actually, and it says, animal neurotransmitter substances are found in plants. Animal neurotransmitter substances are found in plants. What are they talking about? What they're talking about is quite amazing. It's staggering, really. What they've discovered is that neurotransmitters, we could say brain chemicals, the chemicals you need to be happy, to help you to make better decisions, to feel calm, that the neurotransmitters that are in your brain are found in plants. And those substances that are in those plants, you can eat them and actually benefit your brain. So notice where they're found. They're found in plant foods. And so, you know, the animals get them. You can get it secondhand from the animals. I don't know how much makes it through to the animal, but I know for a fact that they're right there in the whole plant-based foods. But that's the thing. If you're eating a bunch of refined, even plant-based foods, so you're eating white bread, and you're eating Twinkies, and you're eating Oreos, and you're eating potato chips, and you're eating all these refined foods, something happens. You will not receive all of the components that you need, these neurotransmitters that are found in the whole plant-based foods. So getting back to them and having a greater diversity of them will give you these neurotransmitters, but also the bacteria that you need to be healthier and happier. So let's go forward. I'd like to show you another study on gut bacteria. And this particular study was done on alcoholics looking at the microbiome or the bacterial makeup of their gut. Now this study was in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it revealed that there was an imbalance in the gut bacteria of certain alcoholics. Now the study was specifically 60 alcoholics, and what they discovered is that 24 of them had lower levels of bacteria in their guts, meaning 24 of them, they looked at their microbiome and they noticed that they had less bacteria within their guts than the other alcoholics. Well, what were the results? Now, after 19 days, alcohol-free, those with the lower levels of bacteria had higher levels of anxious feelings, being depressed, and they had a higher desire for alcohol than the other 36 who had higher levels of gut bacteria. So the 36 who had better flora, better bacteria in their guts, they didn't do as bad. So it seemed to the scientists that those who were having more depression, more anxiety, more cravings, obviously were more likely to go back to the alcohol. Now, just yesterday I was sharing this with a friend of mine who struggles with methamphetamine, and one of the things he said to me is, he said, you know, it's interesting that basically he was talking about, you know, the real addicts. He said, they all eat terrible. You know, I was thinking the same thing, that could it be that what is keeping these people trapped in their addiction is the fact that their microbiome, their gut makeup is just in disarray, and maybe there's something they could do to fix it. It's fascinating to think about, but could it be possible that fruit could help fight addiction? Now, fruit and vegetables. Well, a study was done at the University of Missouri looking at a compound found in fruit and vegetables that may hamper the effect or the addictiveness of meth or methamphetamine. You may have heard of it. It's called resveratrol. Now, it's an antioxidant found in the skin of grapes and other fruit and in some vegetables. But here's the thing. So you think, oh man, wonderful. I can just go get some resveratrol and I'll be doing great. But here's the thing. Not particularly with resveratrol. I don't know if they've discovered it yet, but in some of the other antioxidants, vitamin A, vitamin E, what they've discovered is that people who have higher levels of things like vitamin A, vitamin E in their bodies have lower levels of certain cancer. So the scientists thought, oh, that's wonderful. So all we need to do is supplement vitamin A, vitamin E, and that will lower levels of cancer. So they did it. But guess what happened? When people took the supplements of vitamin A, vitamin E, it actually increased their chances of getting cancer, the same kind of cancers that were lowered in the people who had higher levels in their body. So what's the point? Well, the point is that when you get it in the whole form that God originally made it, that it actually had a beneficial effect on the body. When you try to reduce it to this compound and put it in your body, that it actually was deleterious for your health. So in my estimation, for the general sake of health, you should almost always try to get, if possible, the nutrients from the whole foods themselves. Now, B12 we'll look at later and find that many times plant-based eaters can't get it, so we have to potentially take a supplement. But in general, antioxidants, according to my understanding, you're generally better off getting it in the whole food form. So back to the study. So mice were given resveratrol similar to the amount of what a human would consume in a healthy diet. So they were, just like you'd be able to eat in healthy food, they gave the mice this amount. Well, this is the way methamphetamine works. What happens is dopamine surges in your brain when you partake of methamphetamine. And so what happened is they were giving the resveratrol to these mice, and after 7 days, the resveratrol actually lowered the amount of dopamine surge in the brain that took place in these mice, meaning that it seemed to be actually less addictive to the mice, meaning it would make this substance less addictive to them. And it also lowered the amount of hyperactivity that the mice exhibited. And humans who are on meth, many times they're jittery, they're shaky, they actually struggle with hyperactivity. So it lowered the levels in the mice also. So could it be that partaking of a healthy diet, and remember, as you get a larger diversity of food, you get a larger diversity of bacteria within your gut that's beneficial for you, and that it feeds you the good nutrition that you need as you feed it the nutrition that it needs. So what did they say? Fruit and vegetables can actually benefit someone who is trying to overcome an addiction. Wow. Who would have thought that? Well, somebody would have thought about that 100 years ago. Notice what we read here. This is very fascinating from a book called Counsels in Diet and Foods, page 311. In our medical institutions, clear instruction should be given in regard to temperance. The patients should be shown the evil of intoxicating liquor and the blessing of total abstinence. They should be asked to discard the things that have ruined their health, and the place of these things should be supplied with an abundance of what? Fruit. Oranges, lemons, prunes, peaches, and many other varieties that can be obtained. For the Lord's world is productive if painstaking effort is put forth. So what were we told? We were told that, listen, if somebody's struggling with an addiction, they're struggling with alcohol, teach them how it's impacting, how it's negative. It negatively will impact them, and then teach them to replace it with what? Fruit. And what do we find out now? Back then, 100 years ago, we went, why fruit, right? But now we realize there are neurotransmitters. There are substances in there, not only that, but a diversity of bacteria that will benefit our gut, giving us a greater gut diversity. So as a result, we have less inflammation, less depression, less mental fatigue and memory problems, less depression and all of these things. And so it will make it easier to overcome the addictions. And at the same time, it lowers the addictive nature of the substance itself. And we were told this 100 years. This is so powerful. This is life-changing. And I'll tell you, it's actually changed my life, and that's why I'm sharing these things. When I read these things, I tried it before I knew about the scientific backing. But now it's just coming out regularly. I mean, constantly science is showing another study backing these things up time and again. This is so very powerful, and that's why I wanted to share it with people, because of how much it changed my life. And so here they did a study, University of Queensland in Australia. And they entitled the article on it, they said, fruit is a depression buster for women, meaning fruit gets rid of depression in women. And so what they said, that women with higher consumption of fruits have lower levels of depression, right? So, I mean, most drug addicts wouldn't be doing drugs or at least being addicted to it if they weren't depressed, right? And you'll find that most addicts to food, most addicts to substances, yes, they have bad past experience, but most of us have had bad things happen to us, but not everybody's addicted. And what you'll find is that they've even discovered, they studied alcoholics specifically. And what they showed is that the alcoholics who don't overcome or really struggle more than other alcoholics are the ones with less diversity in their gut bacteria. Once again, why do they have less diversity? Well, it could be maybe partly the C-section from birth. We don't know yet. They haven't tied that for sure later in life. But it could be that. But the thing is, it also is that they probably, and most of the time it is true, they don't eat very well. And as they don't eat very well, they have less diversity, and so they are stressed. They're depressed. And so some time ago, this is very interesting. This is taken from the Journal of Neuropsychiatry and Clinical Neuroscience in the fall of 2010. And the article says depression and fruit treatment. And these doctors were writing into the journal, and they were talking about how you have tryptophan, you have serotonin, you have these neurochemicals, these neurotransmitters found in plant foods, and these could be used, why not use them as intervention for people's, they even talked about for suicidal depression, for depression, to make people happier, to make people healthier. We could do this. Instead of potentially prescribing all kinds of drugs, why don't we use, maybe the idea is, and I'll tell you that's my idea, why not use the frontline treatment, the first line treatment could be trying to change and impact the diet, change your exercise habits, getting out in the sun, getting good sleep, and making sure to get all the nutrition that you need first before anything else. That might be a wonderful way of giving it a try. And so these doctors in this article are talking about how it may benefit to have people on fruit, increasing their fruit consumption to lower their levels of even suicidal depression. Isn't that interesting? And we were told this. We were told this in the past. So here's a slide, telling us happiness in fruit. You say, what? Is there happiness in fruit? Now you think about it. Some people are saying, Chad, but there's sugar in fruit. Sugar can't be good for you. We'll go into more of that later. The reality is this. They did a study putting people in Africa. They put people on, the Bantus and white people, on a diet where they would eat normal food, but they would have to eat on top of it 20 servings of fruit a day. That's a massive amount of fruit. It was the equivalent of 8 cans of soda worth of sugar a day. But they weren't eating sugar, mind you. They were eating the whole food where it's got all the nutrition, all the micronutrients, all the minerals, all the neurochemicals that you need. And guess what happened? They thought, well, it's going to increase their triglycerides. It will increase their blood sugar level with all that sugar, and it will increase their weight because people think it makes you fat. Sugar makes you fat. When we look at the fullness factor, you're going to see that it's just the opposite. Now, yes, refined sugar is not good for you. The whole foods like this are life-changing. Actually, they say this is one of the things that can increase longevity or increase health more than anything else, but we don't have time to go into that right now. So what ended up happening as these people were put on 20 servings a day? You think, man, obviously it would increase their blood sugar levels. It'll make them fat, all that sugar, right? What ended up happening? It didn't do any of the negative things they thought it would. It did not increase their triglycerides, it did not increase their blood sugar levels, and it did not cause them to gain weight. It actually seemed to be beneficial to their health. So it is not something, these ideas, these are just, internet, just ideas that spread around, and people read, oh no, we need to go high fat, and these people many times never see any benefit. They just think they need to do it more and more, and it negatively impacts them time and again. But we see when we get back to these whole plant foods, we see the benefits. And we'll talk more about that later. So let's go on. What about health and happiness and fruit and vegetables? What about this? They did a study here. This study was from the British Journal of Health Psychiatry in January of 2013. This is the title they called it. Many apples a day keep the blues away. Daily experiences of negative and positive effect and food consumption in young adults. They've discovered this not only in young adults, but even older people. It's all people. It's just this study particularly was done on young adults. Well, what ended up happening? They looked at them and they tried to see what food consumption benefits your well-being, your mental outlook, making you feel less depressed. What they found was absolutely amazing. They found that those who ate 7.2 servings of fruit a day, that it benefited their mental well-being with less depression that day, and it went over into the next day. 7.2 servings of fruit. So it benefited them. These things all fit together. And they found the same was true with vegetables, but in order to have vegetables, you'd have to have 8.2 servings of vegetables. These would actually benefit your mental state with that very day, but also it would carry on. And that's why many times people don't notice. They feel bad today and they don't make the association why. And many times it's because of the junk food they were eating or the high-fat foods they were eating, just like the mice would have depressive symptoms with all the high fat. And so many people do this. They're going on these salad diets with all kinds of fat. And they do it for weeks and months and years, and they just get worse and worse and worse. And they think, I just got to stick to it more and more and more. Could it be because their body's not getting all that nutrition they need? And they're clogging up their cells with all that fat. We'll talk more about that later. So what do we see here? What is it? What is it that's taking place here? Part of it is we have these neurochemicals coming into our brain, but we also have in fruit, in whole vegetables, not in fruit juice. If you're doing a juice diet, you don't get all those benefits. Why not? You say, Chad, but all that nutrition, there's something you're missing, and you're missing the fiber. You say, yeah, but we can't digest fiber anyway. That's right. But there's something in our body that can digest fiber and needs to digest fiber and is waiting to digest fiber. And when it does, it gives us something in return for what we gave it. What is it? The bacteria. So all that bacteria, which the majority of it is in our large intestine. And if you don't eat fiber-filled foods, your food gets digested largely before it even gets there. But if you have fiber-filled food like apples, oranges, all kinds of fruit, vegetables, sweet potatoes, if you have all these, what happens is the fiber continues along, makes it into your large intestine. As it makes it into your large intestine, something happens. The bacteria begins to eat it. And as it digests it, it gives from that food, so it digests it, and then it gives to you short-chain fatty acids. Well, what do short-chain fatty acids do? And if you're not giving them fiber, your bacteria can't help you out. So what they do is the short-chain fatty acid lowers your level of inflammation in your body. What's the result of that? Remember, inflammation is a marker of depression. Inflammation is a marker of many chronic diseases. So you can lower the amounts of inflammation, so maybe you'll have less achy joints. They found plant-based diet changes the microbiome in the gut and causes less arthritis. Very interesting. It could potentially lower your depression levels, but you've got to feed that good bacteria, right? What does that bacteria need? So if you're going on just these juice fasts, you're not feeding that bacteria. You'll get some nutrition, but you're missing out on some key components to your health. And so what ends up happening? You want to eat whole fruit, whole vegetables. You can even cook the vegetables. It's good to have as much raw as possible, but nevertheless, it is very good for you. So how do we treat a dyspeptic stomach? Well, what is that? Well, a dyspeptic stomach is of or having indigestion or consequent irritability or depression. So it's stomach trouble that causes irritability and depression. We were told in Counsel and Diet on Foods, for a dyspeptic stomach, you may place upon your tables fruits of different kinds, but not too many at one meal. So what do? We can eat several different fruit to go easy on your stomach if you're stressed and you're having issues. Maybe you need to take it easy and just eat some fruit for a little bit. Not forever, but just for a bit. And so we read here, it would be well for us to do less cooking and eat more fruit in its natural state. Let us eat freely of fresh grapes, apples, peaches, oranges, blackberries, and all other kinds of fruit which can be obtained. These things are so good for you. And so less cooking would help us out also. You start having all kinds of energy. So how can we reset the stomach if we're having these struggles? Well, in many cases of sickness, the very best remedy is for the patient to fast for a meal or two. So just drink water for a meal or two, that the overworked organs of digestion may have opportunity to rest. A fruit diet for a few days has often brought great relief to brain workers. Many times a short period of entire abstinence from food, followed by simple, moderate eating, has led to recovery through nature's own recuperative effort. An abstemious diet, or a simple diet, for a month or two would convince many sufferers that the path of self-denial is the path to health. So what are some of the things we can do to balance our gut? We notice it here. So number one, fast. Number one, fasting. Now that doesn't mean go for a month without eating. We're talking about fasting for a meal or two. And if you have health issues like a diabetic and you can't do that, listen, if you have serious health issues, talk to your doctor before you ever to go on a fast. You don't want to hurt yourself. We're talking about for those who are healthy and they could easily skip a meal and it's not going to negatively impact their health. So fasting for a meal or two, and then you could start by eating just fruit for a couple days. And you'll need to eat plenty. Don't eat yourself an apple and a banana at a meal and feel like that'll cut it. You need to eat, a few bananas and a few apples together at that meal, maybe with a bunch of grapes at that meal. And I mean a bunch. Eat till you're full, actually. And so you're going to go for just a couple days if you can handle it. And what you're going to start getting is you're going to feed that gut bacteria, and they're going to start feeding you that good nutrition that you need, right? So you begin to do this, and then you can add in to it, you can begin after that to eat fruit and bread together. Fruit and bread together. And the actual science shows that for the majority of people, gluten is actually beneficial to the gut. There are people who are celiac and there are people who are sensitive. And if you are one of those, you don't want to be eating gluten. But for the rest of us, it's actually good for us. And we'll talk about that later. So you can eat fruit and bread and then for a few days, and then you begin to add vegetables Another thing to avoid if you're looking to reset your stomach is actually spicy foods. This may come as a surprise, but a study has been done showing that actually they can actually tell someone's character by their spicy food. And it's interesting that we were told this 100 years ago, that spices actually affect the delicate lining of the stomach. And so remember, if you affect the gut, you affect the brain. And so if you're struggling, I would avoid spicy foods altogether. And actually, if you struggle with lust also, this is something that you'd want to do, to avoid spicy foods. And then you can also add about a handful of nuts, but we'll talk more about that as we press forward. And so eating more fruits, eating more whole grains, always whole grains in this situation, and eating more whole vegetables. And these are some things that will benefit you. Now, I want to be clear too, once again, if you're a diabetic, you need to watch out right away diving into sugar. You know, not sugar itself, refined sugar for sure, but even fruit can be too much for you. And we'll talk more about how to overcome the diabetes later on, potentially. The majority of people can. Some people will not be able to, and we're talking type 2 diabetes. Type 1, that is not something that I know of any way to actually reverse presently. But we're going to close with this story. This is true. Victor Valley Medium Community Correctional Facility in Adelanto, California. I'm right here in California right now, and there was a correctional facility, a prison, who was run by an Adventist businessman. This man took it over from the state of California. They gave him the rights to do it, so he got to take it over and to run this place. And as he did, this was a 500-inmate prison. I just talked just this weekend with a doctor who had an opportunity to go in there, and he was one of the doctors that taught the people there. And in this prison, they allowed the inmates to choose between a New Start program, a vegan diet, totally plant-based diet, occupational training, Bible studies, and anger management classes. New Start is nutrition, exercise, water, sunlight, temperance, air, rest, and trust in God. And so they were taught these principles, and they were eating a plant-based diet, but they had a choice. Now, one of the government officials said, there's no way these guys would go vegan, plant-based. They would rather have a riot, right? What happened? They gave them the choice. Nobody was forced into plant-based diet. I don't think anybody should be forced into this, but they gave them the choice. And guess what percentage decided to do it? 85% of people. 85% of these people said, yeah, we'll do it. We're willing to give it a try. Now, keep in mind, at the time, here in California, the recidivism rate. Now, what's recidivism? The recidivism is if you go to prison, what is the statistical chance, or what are the chances that you're going to come back to prison? And at the time, 95% of prisoners, after going to prison the first time in California, were going back to prison. 95% of them. What happened, and that was in the state of California. This prison was in California. When this Adventist businessman took over this prison, and these people chose to go through this program, it went from being 95% of these people going back to prison, and it dropped to 2% of them. 2% of these people. And this was over the course of the 5 years that this man ran the prison. Over the course of these 5 years, it dropped to almost nobody going back. What happened? These people, their gut was being fed, their spiritual life was being fed, their physical life, everything. They were living more like God intended them to live, and it changed their lives. They were transformed. Their mind was renewed. And could it be, if it would affect prisoners to this capacity, could it affect you? Could it affect you? It's affected me. It's changed my life. Now, I'd like to give you a personal testimony as to why I compiled this scientific data, the biblical data. It all basically stemmed from an experience I had back in 2004. I was living in the country of Iceland, and I was living there with a friend of mine, Nathaniel, who later, my friend Fadia, who later became my wife, and she was living upstairs in a house, and we were living 3 guys downstairs. And what happened was we all ended up coming down with stomach trouble, gut trouble. We were drinking the water, and we noticed that we would take a glass of water, and I don't need to go into detail, but immediately we'd have to run to the bathroom, or very shortly after we'd have to run to the bathroom, and we were sick to our stomachs. And this went on. Fadia ended up going to the doctor, and the doctor thought, oh, no, we have good water here. You must just be nervous from traveling. Now, we travel full time. I've traveled for the last 15 years full-time, and up to that point I'd been traveling for years. Traveling didn't really make us nervous, but the doctor thought really maybe it was just something, it was nerves. Well, all three of us I ended up losing 30 pounds. My friend Nathaniel lost weight, Fadia lost weight, and we had stomach trouble for that entire year. But then we came back to the United States the next year, and for the entire next year we were still sick, and finally it began to get a bit better. It never got exactly the way it was beforehand. Well, for the first time in my life I experienced seasonal depression while I was in Iceland. And then each winter after that, I experienced seasonal depression. Now, obviously, the darkness of Iceland for sure was a contributing factor. I don't question that one bit. But it was interesting that even back in the States, after that, each year I had that. Later on, after about 8 or 9 years, the depression then didn't go away in the summer. It actually continued even into, the rest of the year. And I was really quite down. A year or so before that, I had some tick bites, and so had to get some antibiotics. And you may know that antibiotics, one of the things they do is they kill bacteria. It's kind of like a scatter shot. It just kind of kills these things. And so then I carried on. After that point is when I came to kind of the worst point of the depression. Through the summer, through the winter, it just continued on. And in general, I lived a very healthy lifestyle. I lived a plant-based diet. I drank adequate amounts of water. The suggestions that many have on drinking a lot of water, I drank it. I exercised virtually every day of the week, running, lifting weights. I love to exercise, and I almost never go a day without it. And so I was living out the health principles, getting out in the sunlight, and nothing was actually making a difference at all. I just was very, very down. I tried the different supplements that were suggested to me. Nothing really made any substantial difference. Then I read this strange quotation. Somebody had suggested back in the 1800s, they said, "We are coming to the time when recipes for cooking will not be needed. For God's people will learn that the food God gave Adam in his sinless state is the best for keeping the body in a sinless state." And when I heard that, I thought, the food God gave Adam in a sinless state. And I thought, well, that's, ultimately they were fruit. You'd have food like cucumbers or, squash and these kind of things, plants with seeds in it. It wasn't even the veggies yet. Now, I still eat veggies, just in case you're wondering. And, so I started to eat high quantities of fruit. Now, this was before I had all the scientific backing, looking at the scientific studies on this specific issue. And so I began to eat very high quantities, entire meals of fruit. And I did this for about 2 weeks. Now, keep in mind, this was literally the last half of December when I started doing this. So the last 2 weeks of December, bringing me into January, and I had been in depression, I had been stressed, and I realized that it wasn't from an experience that had happened, it was just kind of a general depression. And so I began to do this, and about 2 weeks into it, I believe it was exactly January 1st. So I started about 2 weeks earlier eating this way, and then January 1st, I was driving across the country with my wife, and I noticed for the first time on January 1st, which should be the worst part of the year for someone struggling with seasonal affective disorder, I noticed for the first time my mind began to change. I began to be able to control my thoughts. Instead of having these depressive, anxious thoughts, that I actually could choose to control and choose what I thought about. And I noticed that, and I noticed that distinct change that day, and it continued to get better. Later on, I began to look into the science. I began to think, do some people live this way? And I noticed that other people had, and that it had changed their lives in untold ways, health issues, these kind of things. Now, to be very clear, I still eat vegetables. I still eat, sweet potatoes, beans, and all these things, because beans also were part of the garden diet. Anything with the seed, and the bean is a seed also. So eating those things also, for sure. Greens are amazing for you, these different kinds of things. But eating grains also, that was a part of the garden diet. And so as I was doing it, it began to change my mind, and I have never felt better. The transformation that has taken place in my life has just been absolutely astounding. And so I wanted to share with others that, hey, if you're in a healthy state, you're not diabetic, and this is something you could maybe try. If you've been struggling, maybe it's something you'd like to say, hey, I've tried other things. Why not give it a try? The science now backs it up that, 7 to 8 servings of fruit or vegetables can actually make you happier in a very short order. And like I said, within 2 weeks, my mind began to change. And you may find the very same thing. They just did a newer study recently that I haven't put in the original video, and this time they looked at 12 or 13,000 people. I think it was just over 12,000 people. They found the very same thing, that it actually increases levels of happiness when people eat 7 to 8 servings. Amazing. And so the initial study showed it. Now they looked at a larger group of people, and we're seeing the effects. And getting back to the way God intended humans to eat, I believe, is the best for human health and happiness. So maybe you should consider giving it a try. And you're going to find that actually this diet actually helps you to lose weight and get to a healthy weight also. So let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time to look at science, to look at your word. The Bible talks about this gut-brain connection. And we see, Father, that modern science says, you know what, wow, they were right. And we're seeing that your word is true, and it's changing, and it's transforming to us in the 21st century. I pray that you would draw us each nearer to you. In the name of Jesus, amen.